why they actually fail to do their business like in the US or other regions?
I think there's a two major factor.
Right.
One is because they coming into the Series C. In the Series C, your product is pretty much done, and also you have done some success in the Japanese market. The people tend to think I can succeed in the US market, but market is totally different.
Right.
This is a problem. So many founders could go to Silicon Valley maybe in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And then they got influence from this culture. But after coming back to Tokyo, they don't forget. But it's difficult to influence or keeping influence. So this is founders' pain point. So what do you think? If we want to making Japanese startup ecosystem activate, what kind of a to-do list we should do? What do you think?
Large corporation can no longer provide some lifetime employment system. So they are hiring a lot of, not the new recruitment, but to hire some midterm or, more experienced people. So job liquidity has been dramatically increased, more liquidity. And, I see many young people who wants to challenge rather than, going to the large corporation is a good thing. They can challenge, the people can challenge in that platform. And entrepreneurship is also a good thing because, there's another challenge, there's another achievement that they can do by doing by himself or him or herself. So, but the common thing is, people, if you go to the large organizations, you have to be patient. You have to have some certain way to make your dream come true. So I think that, there's nothing wrong with that. And also, there's a lot of people doing a lot of great challenge in the large corporations. But the one thing that for at least is, especially young people's mindset is changing. What I impress or I like about the U.S. culture is this kind of pay it forward culture.
Pay it forward.
Pay it forward. So in the Silicon Valley, everybody is help each other, how to make build a company, how to interact with your customer and how to interact with your investor. I think it's pretty natural even in the Japanese mindset. If you do something hard, you start to feel like, okay, I can teach this. And if you do something hard, and if you see some young guy or some other guys is trying to do some same challenge, the people tend to think, okay, I can help this guy. There's a level of the desires, and the self realization is one of the desire that you will like to achieve after satisfying the food or other demand. So I think it's pretty natural, and if we see more of the entrepreneur here, we started to see more people trying to pay it forward, and we are seeing that. There's a lot of great Japanese entrepreneurs, successful one, try to have some do some venture investment or doing some accelerator program. So I think the population is much larger, and variety is much larger in the U.S. But I also I think it's basically a human culture. It's not built by the some country or races. It's more getting into the human. So I think I'm optimistic about the Japanese people have this kind of pay it forward or culture. So it will come. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have the one quick question. I've seen a lot of a Japanese company actually going to US and fail, right?
Yeah.
Especially I can't really mention the name of the company, but there are some Series C or Series D company going to US or other regions, but most of them actually fail, or they don't really expand their business. And I just like to, from your point of view, why they actually fail to do their business like in the US or other regions.
I think there's a two major factor.
Right.
One is because they coming into the Series C. In the Series C, your product is pretty much done. So you are trying to sell the product. You're not feeling it's a product out kind of strategy, not a market in.
Right.
And also you have done some success in the Japanese market, but the success it has become some kind of innovation dilemma.
Right.
The people tend to think I can succeed in the U.S. market, but market is totally different.
Right.
So if this person is trying to think about the U.S. market or whatever, Singapore market or Thailand, Vietnam, whatever the market is, and try to fit the product for those markets, specific market, they can win. So I think I will recommending all the startup in Japan to start the globalization from the day one.
Day one.
Yeah.
From like a seed round.
Yeah, seed round. Yeah, I mean you can try to raise some money from Japanese investor, but you have to, if you want to go to the U.S. market, you have to solve the issue of the problem of the American customer, not the Japanese customer. So I think that's one thing. Another one is I think the teaming. Many people tend to work only with the Japanese people. Work with only Japanese people in Silicon Valley, or if it is in New York. So, but I think the good thing about working with them, I mean, it is critical to work with American people, and it's also critical to understand him or her, or motivate him or her. So let them drive.
Right.
So I think having some good local partners, whether if you want to go to Vietnam, you definitely need to work with the Vietnam people. So I think work with the local people and more on the partner level. Not the boss and
Associate.
the associate kind of relationship. Let them have more ability, let them have more decision making power, and let's consult. Let's work together how to make this company or make this product sellable to this U.S. specific market. So that's that's two things that I can recommend for those people who want to go to U.S. market.
I see. And I just got also the kind of question from one of the startup companies in Japan, and identify or penetrating in the the community of the ecosystem in the US. It's quite hard. And do you have any advice on how to actually identify and also get into those ecosystem in the US, because that's the most challenging part for Japanese startup, I think.
I mean, first of all, you have to live there.
Right.
Live, not to visit. This is so important. And many people has misunderstood.
Yeah.
You are right.
You have to live there, and just try to be there, as a long term. I mean, when I was in the U.S., I decided to take the green card. I was fortunate enough to get the green card, because otherwise, people are not going to believe that okay, Ken he's going back to the Japan for after 5 years or so. Who's going to believe you? Who's going to build some real relationship? And also, you be there and talk to many people and be friend of them. And it's not the Japanese American kind of thing. If you think about in Silicon Valley, most of the startup is coming from the foreign countries, including India, Taiwan, China, Korea, or Middle East, wherever. So for this guy, it was, for there was a first experience. He's living in Silicon Valley, but he gradually and try to expand the network. So I think just live there and try to be the local people, contribute to the society, and be a citizen in there. I mean, it's maybe hard to get some. There should be some visa issue and U.S. citizenship issue, but try to and then sooner or later, if you live there for 5 years, you'll be part of that ecosystem. Yeah.
Spend as much time you can to get network and also.
Yeah, because you're making the business in that country,
Right.
or you have to work with a team with living in that country.
Right.
You have to persuade your customer in that country to buy your product, and you have to raise money from those countries. So I think it's not that if you start a business there, the customer is a king. Yeah, you build a stakeholder of that country. I mean, if you think about vice versa, let's say some
Come from the US.
come from US and be there, but we don't know how long he's going to be. But if he really having some party or some really getting to really understand the culture, we really feel like, okay, this guy likes Japan so much, and then we build a trust. So I think if you sit on the different side of the table, you will understand what is necessary.
Right.
Yeah.
The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Ken, part 2. 1. Japanese founders struggle to bring Silicon Valley culture back home. Many Japanese entrepreneurs get inspired by the energy of Silicon Valley, but struggle to maintain that mindset once they return to Japan. This is because Japan's startup ecosystem lacks the same level of risk-taking, open knowledge sharing, and founder-driven innovation. To truly transform Japan's startup culture, founders need to create a long-term ecosystem that continuously fosters entrepreneurship and global ambition. 2. Japanese startups should prepare for global expansion from day one. Many Japanese startups fail in the US or other global markets because they try to expand too late, often at Series C. Ken emphasizes that founders should start thinking globally from the seed stage, designing products for international customers, not just Japan. Successful expansion requires working with local partners as equal, not just hiring Japanese teams abroad. 3. The only way to build a strong presence in the US is to live there. Simply visiting Silicon Valley won't work. Founders need to physically relocate and integrate into the ecosystem to build trust and credibility. Ken shares his personal experience of embedding himself in the US startup scene, which helped him develop deep relationships with investors, customers, and partners. For Japanese founders to succeed globally, they must commit long-term, immerse in the local culture, and contribute to the community. Okay, thank you so much for watching our conversation today. We hope today's episode will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give it a like. Next episode is the conversation with Ken part 3. Please stay tuned. Bye bye. またね。